technical session of the two-day international webinar on the topic Women and Development, organized by the Department of Economics, University of Kerala. Myself, Shreya. The duty vested with me is to formally welcome you all to the session. Moving on to my duty. First and foremost, I welcome Dr. Christabel PJ, Associate Professor, Department of Economics, who is chairing the session. Dr. Christabel PJ got her PhD in Economics from the Department of Economics, University of Kerala in 2004. She worked as a faculty member in ICFAI, National College, University of Gondo, Ethiopia, Government College Nedumangad, and Government College for Women, Trivandrum. She has got the coveted A.N. Raj Fellowship on Research Grant for Researchers in Economics, instituted by CDS in 2013 and by Indian Council of Social Science Research for the publication of her doctoral thesis in 2007. She has many publications and experience of participating and conducting conferences added to her kitty. Being an authority in gender and women's studies by herself, we look forward to your creative addition to the conference now. Hearty welcome to you.
Thank you.
Secondly, I cordially invite, thank you, ma'am. Secondly, I cordially invite Dr. Mythri Prasad, postdoctoral fellow at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and Mr. Lars Aaberg, doctoral candidate in gender studies at School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, who are the reputed speakers of this session on the topic Pure Labor and Materialities of Infrastructure, a study of trans women workers in Kochi Metro. Dr. Mythri Prasad is a critical geographer whose research interests primarily revolve around migration and urban transformation in contemporary India. She received her PhD from CDS, Kerala, and building on political economy, radical geography, and ethnographic methods, her doctoral research traces different types of recruitment of migrants and local Malayali workers that reflect political contests and settlements between trade unions, corporate construction companies, and recruitment agencies. Among her recent publications are two articles, Cards and Carriers, Politics of Identification in Kerala, South India, in Contemporary South Asia, and The Cultural Politics of Wages, Ethnography of Construction Work in Kochi, India, in Contribution to Indian Sociology. Warm welcome to you, ma'am. Mr. Lars Aaberg holds a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy and Women's Studies from University of California at Los Angeles and a Master of Philosophy in Gender Studies from University of Oslo. His doctoral research centers on pure labor and politics in India, taking conversations over pure diversity and inclusion policies and practices among and between Bangalore's private sectors and civil society activists as his entry point. He is also working on a research centered on Kerala development and gender in another project on trans labor. He has previously held affiliations with Norwegian Institute for Urban and Regional Research in Oslo and CDS Trivandrum. Heartfelt welcome to you, sir. I also welcome Ms. Parvati L. of First MA Economics, who will be proposing the vote of thanks in this session. Last but not the least, on behalf of the entire Department of Economics, I welcome all other dignitaries, faculty members, and all participants who have joined us today. You can raise your queries and doubts in the chat box, and those will be addressed at the end of the session. Thank you, and have a great time learning, unlearning, and relearning.
So shall we start? Siddhi?
Yes, sure. You are now in charge.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. A warm good morning to one and all. Professor Anida, Head of the Department of Economics, Siddiq Rabia, the Organizing Secretary, my dear colleagues, and the participants of this conference. We are today moved to the second day of the International webinar on women, hosted by the Department of Economics, University of Kerala. So today morning, we are going to listen from Lars Aaberg and Mythri Prasad Eliama on pure labor and materialities of infrastructure, a study of transgender workers in Kochi Metro. A warm welcome to both of you. A few words before handing over that charge to both of them. The workplace has always been a central arena for the creation of discrimination and exploitation. Gender gap in employment, gender segregation at work, wage differential, sexual harassment at workplace are widely discussed in the academic arena for years together, for decades together. The gender gap exists in education, skill acquisition, less mobility, etc., make the labor force participation, especially the female labor force participation, at the low level or minimum. Though laws are available in countries, especially in India, on the different aspects of labor markets, we know that the execution and enforcement of these laws are almost ineffective. When it comes to the specific case of Q labor, the dimensions of labor market widens. Or in other words, we can see that apart from whatever issues we observe in the labor market, extra issues come into the center stage. Some of them are contestation of sexual minority identities, workplace right, and so on. These issues they have to encounter along with a lot of other issues in their day-to-day life. When it comes to the specific case of Kerala, a good example to embrace the Q community in the labor market is done by the Kochi Metro Rail Limited, KMRL, some years back. So the newspaper headings at that time, it is hit it is like that Kochi Metro works to bridge transgender gap. And according to Kochi Metro, they say that they want to send out the message that transgenders are welcome in corporate entities. Through the Kudumbashree mission, 23 people from transgender community offered jobs, and they were appointed in several departments ranging from ticketing to housekeeping. Later, 2 years down the line, the newspaper headings changed like this. Transgender staff to Kochi Metro struggled to keep life on track. Of the 23 people employed initially, only 6 working now due to low salary, high rent, lack of viable accommodation facilities that forced the exodus from the metro rail to their own type of jobs, like going as delivery persons in Uber Eats and so on. So I'm not elaborating the stories, but we have been watching all these things over the last 3 years in newspapers and media on the plight of this group, that is Q community in Kerala. I hope Lars Aaberg and Mythri Prasad is going to explore deeper into the issues we come to know via newspapers and visual media. A warm welcome to both of you, and over to you. Thank you so much. Any problem, Lars? Okay.
Oh, hi. Just first and foremost, thank you, Ms. Shreya Menon, for the kind introduction. And as you mentioned, I was on exchange at CDS, and it's an honor to reconnect with Trivandrum. And thank you as well, Professor Christabel PJ and Mr. Siddiq Rabiat and the Department of Economics for having us. Mythri, would you like to start?
Thank you for that warm introduction and welcome, Christabel and Shreya. And I'm really happy to be here. My presentation is going to be about the based on an ethnographic fieldwork that I did. And it is a kind of a counter narrative in terms of, what Christabel has laid out, the why are workers leaving the metro jobs. And this is an in-depth ethnography of one of the workers who left it. And when Lars speaks, you will know more about the broader context in which this queer politics is embedded.
Yes. I'm Rishikesh.
Yeah. So I'm going to be reading from my paper. I'll try to make sure that, it's as engaging as possible. This is partly because this is a very new terrain for me. My work is, as Shreya has described, it's basically on migrant labor. And I focus mostly on male migrant labor. So this is actually new terrain for me, working on, issues of women and labor and development. So this section, it's titled Laboring as Women. The section draws on the experience of a transgender person, Nihal, who left the job as a metro worker within a few months of starting it. They were acutely aware of the contradictory relationship between empowerment, autonomy, and visibility, and the project to include transgender workers in capitalist spaces of work. Nihal's subjecthood is anchored in the history of transgender resistance against discrimination and violence, especially focusing on public space, and the reclaiming of public space that is central to this resistance. So we will just dive into what exactly happened, what was the context in which trans workers were employed in the metro rail corporation. Trans women in Kochi, trans women are often detained by the police. So in July 2017, 17 trans women were arrested by the police when they collectively resisted the attempts by a thief who tried to rob them of their earnings from sex work. Transgender activists accompanied by allies meaning, activists and other social workers who raise queer issues in the public space. So transgender workers, these transgender activists accompanied by allies met the city police commissioner and raised it as a political question of right to life and livelihood, right to be in the public space and right to, carry on with an occupation. The commissioner's office happened to be on top of the Kochi Metro Rail Limited's office. So this was a kind of a happy accident where the commissioner remembered that, oh, why not employ these workers in this new avenue of livelihood that's opening up. So it was the commissioner's idea to get in touch with the managing director of the metro, alias George at the time, and negotiate for jobs for trans women. So what we see here is that, the state is interested in withdrawing these trans people from public space and occupations that are geared towards public space, specifically sex work and begging. The carceral and punitive aspects of the state bleeds into the construction of laboring bodies. The space, so it might look like, that the police commissioner's office and the place of the infrastructure, like the head office of Cochin Metro, are are spatially adjacent, but it signifies a conceptual intermeshing where the redrawing of the city space through changes in mobility practices are intimately connected to the regulation and control of populations that are deemed unruly and ungovernable. So here what we see is that to construct a laboring body, a laboring subject, you need to actually, withdraw them from existing occupations. These occupations might carry also a moral, might be embedded in a moral economy that is not suitable to the imaginations of space that that the new city is embedded in. So this was the, this was how it started. So a few months later, faced with low wages and lack of affordable housing, the workers met the managing director of the Metro Corporation again. So when the workers complained about their low wages, the managing director said, he said, "You will only get as much consideration as women get. Don't expect more." So this was said in Malayalam. നിങ്ങൾക്ക് സാധാരണ സ്ത്രീകൾക്ക് കിട്ടുന്ന അത്രയും പരിഗണനയൊക്കെ കിട്ടുള്ളൂ, അതിൽ കൂടുതൽ എക്സ്പെക്ട് ചെയ്യരുത്, അതിൽ കൂടുതൽ പ്രതീക്ഷിക്കരുത്. Unpacking this statement may lead us to take immense scholarly risks, but it helps to start with some obvious questions. What consideration does the state give to women? If citizenship as women involve accepting gendered labor practices that regard trans women as worthy of only wages that are below subsistence, how do we understand this citizenship? So here we are faced with, the question of the relationship between the question of women's work as we traditionally conceive it and the incorporation of transgender workers into feminized forms of labor. So this is what I'm interested in this short piece. So wages for occupations that are considered women's work tend to be low in Kerala, and transgender workers are incorporated into this realm of differentiated economic citizenship by the Kudumbashree program. And here what we should note is that, in the Kochi Metro, at least initially, transgender workers were not part of any Kudumbashree units. They were employed as workers with a job offer and all of that. So it was a formalized, formal job in that sense with offer letters, even though that, they got those job offers after some, activist work. So another set of questions emerge parallelly on women's participation in labor market and its significance for our understanding of capitalism. Participation in paid work is considered liberating and is supposed to tilt the balance of power within the family in favor of women. The interventions of the state through Kudumbashree are on these lines of developmentalist understanding of women's participation in the labor market. This developmentalist understanding is shared both by neoclassical economics and Marxist feminism, and to be specific, Marxist-Leninism. So, and here I move to an interesting feminist theoretician who actually lives right here in New York. And her seminal work is called Caliban and the Witch. So her name is Silvia Federici. She talks about, how women were dispossessed and how they suffered defeat in peasant communities, how they were dispossessed in medieval Europe. When they were part of peasant communities, women had immense control over production through technology. They were inventors, they were innovators, but the reaction, so she considers capitalism as a reactionary force that defeated women. So Silvia Federici argues that capitalism was a reactionary development that undermined women's position. By negating the liberatory potential of capitalism and the potential for mass organization through its centralizing tendencies, and by upholding feudal peasant communities and the autonomy of women in these communities, Federici both revises and deepens Marxist understanding of women's historical subordination. So this is a dialectical story, right? It goes back and forth, but Federici's claim is that capitalism was not good for women, unlike, you know, how we in traditional economics posits it, that, you know, if as capitalism develops, women get into the labor market, and that is advantageous for women. This is the notion with which Federici disagrees. Following Federici, one can see the rejection of paid feminized labor by some transgender workers in Kochi and hesitation in the face of incorporation into the capitalist workspace as assertion of autonomy. So you can, in a way, you can say that, you know, as an urban autonomous community, transgender people inhabit public space in a mode that is antagonistic to the class power that inheres in the state. So you can say that, you know, their hesitation to be part of this capitalist workspace or feminized workspace is an act of resistance. However, the material history of the presence of transgender people in urban spaces in Kerala is different. So this is something we have to keep in mind. As migrants who decided to return and occupy these spaces. So unlike other South Indian states, we didn't have this urban presence of hijras until very recently. And it's only in 2014-15 that they decide to come back and, you know, occupy and be here. As migrants who decided to return and occupy these spaces, they point to a wider diasporic history of hijras in India and bring with them, when they came back, those cultures of autonomy and alternative kinship that they encountered in the metropolitan cities. So my interlocutor, my informant Nihal, pointed out that the ritual forms of coming out, for example, it's called Jalsa, when you come out, you know, as a transgender person, and alternative kinship forms such as Guru Chela system or fictive kinship, these do not have much of a historical grounding in Kerala. So many of the practices that we traditionally associate with you know, other queer communities outside Kerala, they don't have much of a history in Kerala. In this sense, the long arc of development and social reform and the distinct spatial formation devoid of large metropolitan cities could have forced transgender people to migrate to other parts of India. When they returned, they were incorporated under the category of transgender. So they were incorporated as transgender, not as these traditional categories like Kothi or Hijra. And that is not under any so-called Indian category. So they were incorporated as modern subjects, at least, you know, category-wise. So this kind of points to some revision of, you know, what Silvia Federici proposes. So here I want to refer to the work of Lawrence Cohen, an anthropologist, who points out in his paper called The Kothi Wars, AIDS and Cosmopolitanism and the Morality of Classification. So Lawrence Cohen points out that sexual identities that have indigenous roots are marshaled into form a coherent category in the context of transnational activism around HIV and efforts to get funding for prevention. So what Cohen's point is that, you know, identities like Kothi or Hijra, they might be indigenous, but at the same time, they become a proper category, a developmental category, only in the context of capitalism. And for example, in this case, the context of HIV prevention and the funding for HIV prevention throughout the 1990s and 2000s. This points to the ways in which flows of capital are intimately connected to the formation of subject-making choices and their territorialization. Federici's position that capitalism undermines women's position is contradicted by Cohen's insistence on flows of capital being central to the production of categories that condition queer subjectivity. So this lets us circle back to more recent work by Silvia Federici that critiques social constructivist and post-structuralist theories of gender and argues that bodies that conform to a feminine gender face devaluation in the labor market. So what Federici, in 2020, she says that, if you are traditionally feminine, you face discrimination because of that. Not necessarily because, of what you do, but because who you are. So this is a very complex terrain, which even I'm uncertain how to approach. So this is just like recording my uncertainty rather than taking a position in that sense. This echoes earlier feminist interventions so her position seems like going back to some kind of 70s feminism, especially in terms of women and work, where the work of men is often deemed inferior simply because it is women who do it. The terms of inclusion as citizens and workers hinges on accepting these terms set for women workers. The varied daily and intergenerational reproductive activities centered around the traditional family acts as both a refuge and burden in the case of, let's say cis heterosexual women. And this family as refuge and burden is something that trans people negotiate in a different way. Nihal remembered how they had to seek accommodation in a lodge. So this is about, how Nihal, when they were employed in the metro, they remembered how they had to take accommodation in a lodge in Kochi. So just to be employed, you needed to have accommodation, and they had to pay 500 rupees as rent, along with 3 other people. And the wages from the metro rail work was rupees 13,000. So that included PF and ESI. So after cutting PF and ESI, they only would get 9,000 rupees. So even that, even to have that formal, the social security that comes from formal sector in itself makes their lives more precarious, because they are not, getting that money. So we are faced with the continuum of formal and informal. It's more about how people negotiate these, terrains than about whether it is strictly formal or informal. By creating kinship bonds among themselves and diversifying the occupations within a living arrangement. So the trans people who were living together, they were diversifying their, so everybody can't be doing this feminized, low paid work if they were going to, survive in this. So transgender workers negotiate these low wages, but only transiently. So even their negotiation is very precarious. Nihal is skeptical of such arrangements and the attempts to carve out a queer femininity that has cultural transactional value as they mock such kinship relationships and their claims to authenticity. Without much ritual or sacred basis in Kerala, these kinship bonds are not easily translatable into the modern subjecthood within which queer politics in Kerala is embedded in. Sex work figures as a better paid alternative that is abandoned in favor of gaining more visibility and mainstream acceptance for transgender people. Taking up the work in Kochi Metro was seen as an important activist work that would change the narrative around transgender identity in Kerala. So many of them, even though it was low paid, they were ready to take it up to change the narrative, as activists. Nihal was a construction worker a few years ago in Thrissur. So Nihal's previous history as a worker is also interesting here. They were a construction worker a few years ago in Thrissur and used to wait in street corner spot labor markets. I don't know whether many of you might have seen migrant workers standing in the morning in, near, not only migrant workers, even, all workers who are casual laborers stand in street corner markets, right? So Nihal also stood like that. And many a times they used to end up not being hired. So it was very difficult to get hired in these places because these Mythris feared they will be marked as homosexuals if they hired Nihal. So this discrimination is very open. So finally, what Nihal did was eventually a transgender Mythri started operating from there, the poverty in Thrissur, and Nihal joined their group of workers. So finally, only when a transgender Mythri came up that, you know, they could join the casual labor market. And Nihal is the primary earner. In their family, Nihal is the primary earner and caregiver in their family, consisting of their mother and brothers and sisters who are ill. They are also burdened by various debts and other financial obligations. So there is loan on the house, there a vehicle they have bought needs, you know, periodic reimbursements. So they are also burdened by various debts and other financial obligations. These financial and caregiving ties that Nihal maintained with their natal household, even as they negotiated and contested their families and neighbors' transphobia, provides us an interesting counterpoint to the narrative about alternative kinship forms that frame the mainstream narrative on trans folk. So this is also interesting because we always think that, you know, they exit from their families, but that's not the case when you look closely. They still maintain ties with their family and are still responsible to their family, some of them at least, not all of them. The multi-locational and multi-occupational livelihoods that frame Nihal's life is not unlike the proletarian lives that a majority of Dalit Bahujans lead. As Swati Shah details in her book, construction work, sex work, and other low-paid work, whether it is in the formal or informal sector, are all part of a narrow field of livelihood options that are available to the poor. So when we look at this, you know, job in the metro station, we have to see that as part of a very, you know, set of narrow options that are available to workers in general and trans folk in particular. The centering of biological femininity and reproductive and care labor that Frederici proposes as the locus of devaluation and dispossession ignores the experience of trans people as workers in the formal sector in occupations that are considered feminized and devalued. Their rejection of low-paid formal work and the promise of discursive inclusion and citizenship through labor comes from a history of resistance and autonomy that draws on both a repertoire of laboring cells and formation of alternative kinship bonds and negotiation of traditional productive and reproductive roles in the family. So what I want to say is that, you know, you cannot just say that it is the biological femininity that is leading to this devaluation. It's not. That's being problematized a little through when we look closely the experience of trans workers. And what we also see is that, you know, people are embedded in a, there's the livelihood options that are available to them are very narrow. And that doesn't change much through this intervention. That's all now. Over to Lars, and that will be more about the, you know, the broader aspects of the question.
Thank you, Mythri. I just wanted to get a quick check. How are we doing on time? I prepared about 20 minutes. Is that, I'll just go forward and then you can let me know if I'm going over time or you can cut me off, yeah. So, yeah, I'm taking a slightly different, I'm sorry? Okay. I'm taking a slightly different tack than Mythri. My background is both in queer studies as well as development, and I spent my time at CDS really studying Kundambashri. So I'm going to go more in the development angle and then look at how we can use infrastructure to theorize sexuality. So for me, for us, the project really begins with an observation made by Hannah Appel, Nikhil Anand, and Akhil Gupta in their edited volume, The Promise of Infrastructure. They argue that, quote, Infrastructures are critical locations through which sociality, governance, and politics, accumulation and dispossession, and institutions and aspirations are formed, reformed, and performed. Infrastructures promise access to markets, jobs, and distribution of public services. And in the face of their failure to make good on these promises, which is quite often the experience for poor communities the world over, infrastructures become the site to make and contest political claims. The idea of the failed promises of infrastructure immediately speaks to the widely held narratives that describe what has happened and also what seems inevitable in Kochi Metro's experiment in employing trans women staff through the Kundambashri Poverty Alleviation Program. Given the Metro's inability to retain its trans women employees en masse, queer activists and the popular press share an understanding that the Metro has failed to deliver on the promise of social uplift through mainstream, stable, and respectable employment. And this, of course, is what both Mythri and Professor Christabel were saying in the beginning, that it's widely considered a failure. So it was this idea of the failed project of development in an infrastructural site that prompted our initial interest in the Metro as a place in which we could utilize ethnographic methods to investigate what Apple et al. Have called the ruins of an anticipated future and the debris of anticipated or experienced liberal modernity. In our title, we emphasize materialities of infrastructure because we aim to underscore not only how the aesthetic can come to govern sexual subjects following a queer rendition of Asher Gertner in his Rule by Aesthetics, but also how the subaltern can be said to, quote, hail the state, rather than just, in queer theory, individuals are always hailed and not speaking back to the state. And they argue that through infrastructure, the subaltern can actually speak back to the state. And so utilizing ethnographic methods, our aim is to hold in tension both how the state might aim to govern the sexual subaltern, but also how infrastructure creates the conditions by which the subaltern can demand recognizability before the state, as well as make claims on urban space and citizenship in the very space in which the promise of trans inclusion is said to lie in ruin and debris. And so for my part of this presentation, the investigation really ties two interlinking concerns together. I want to analyze transgender politics in the House of Kundambashri by drawing on extant feminist and development studies literature. And then I will then go on to conclude with a queer analysis of infrastructure to locate the meaning of transgender belonging in a rapidly changing small city. And so different from Mythri, I will discuss the voices who found promise in the Kundambashri. You probably noticed that Mythri was really highlighting people who were quite skeptical or perhaps didn't find promise in the program. And so I'm switching tone to analyzing why certain people actually did believe in the Metro and are still employed there today. And like Mythri, I'm also theorizing, I'm focusing on wages and housing. And so as Professor Christabel had mentioned, those are quite known aspects of the idea of the failed project, but I'm kind of providing a how or an anatomy of that failure. So it did not take long. So as we know, the popular press quickly reported on the failures of the project. And in hindsight, this appears quite an obvious outcome of a narrowly defined intervention into poverty, especially when trans folks are more often diasporic, if not displaced, as Mythri mentioned. The result is that for many of the trans workers, the Kundambashri program is a last resort. For those aging out of sex work, for example, the Metro offered wages when a few other options existed, despite being admittedly meager compensation, okay? And yet, for those workers who found the Metro to hold great political and cultural promise, the poor wages were offset by the opportunity to position themselves as strong, independent caretakers for their daughters and among their wider fictive kin. Departing from the disciple-guru-chela relation is typical among Hijras and other third genders in North India, and even Tamil Nadu, right? Several women described themselves as mothers responsible for younger trans women who they referred to as their daughters in an almost more secular sense, okay? Quote, "I want to show my daughter that this type of work is possible, that we can command respect in the city." And so for these workers, their claim to urban citizenship and empowerment using metaphors of visibility actually aligns with that of the Kundumbashree at large. One informant says, "I brought my daughter to the metro, now she has a job here too." This is particularly significant when considering that one's income from Kundumbashree is much lower than sex work. Even more so when trans women households engage in collective economic practices in which most members earn money through sex work, and that the higher earnings of relatively younger kin are generally seen as an obligation in order to maintain ties to the family and access the general social support. So in fact, even the most ardent supporters of Kundumbashree admitted that they and their daughters had to subsidize their wages with sex work. The political vision of trans empowerment, in fact, necessitated the very forms of labor the program sought to dissuade trans women away from. Yeah. So in practice then, the employment at the metro seems an extension of many gender and development initiatives. Programs that aim to mainstream women's employment have sought to move poor women away from informal or illegal remunerative practices toward more regularized forms of work with the promise that such work is more reliable, safe, and provides the social dividends of respectability. The sometimes tacit, at other times explicit rationale is that the laboring women's respectability is a form of social capital that can then be converted into economic security. While widespread, such initiatives have been criticized for the underlying moralism that tends to value certain forms of work above others, as Mythri was saying, and as we are quite familiar with if you've studied development at all, right? This all amounts to reformist efforts to incorporate women into an unequal system of labor rather than attempting to disrupt or change the values ascribed to different forms of work that serve to unequally ascribe value in the labor market. Drawing on analysis from J. Devika and Benita V. Tampi, who have criticized Kundumbashree for reproducing gender inequality through the very practices that promise alternative egalitarian futures. For them, although Kundumbashree does provide unique opportunities for women to engage in formal politics, the program is problematic from the outset because the program defines development as the redistribution of minimum entitlements rather than productive assets like land. And at the same time, women are defined in a utilitarian relationship to their families. The Kundumbashree program, they argue, places women at the center of below poverty line families, who are then educated to become the responsible women citizens who financially and socially manage their families, utilizing the economic resources provided by Kundumbashree, along with heavy-handed educational programs that aim to responsibilize the developmental subjects into altruistic consumer citizens. The experiences of trans women workers at Kochi Metro offers a complex rendering of the issues at stake in development programs that offer socioeconomic uplift through respectable forms of remuneration. Indeed, Kundumbashree's lack of providing comprehensive support for the workers, the majority of whom migrated from outside Ernakulam, resonates with Devika and Tampi's aforementioned criticisms. That without support for affordable housing, as we've mentioned, the program only risks reproducing dependency networks which seem to run antithetical to the vision of equitable citizenship in idealistic renderings of liberal democratic societies, but in fact requires the very economic practices the program aims to diminish or make less attractive, right? And yet, in the context of widespread police brutality, surveillance, and the criminalization of gender non-binary formations in India, we can begin to understand the promise Kundumbashree holds for some of our informants. Drawing on queer theorist Jose Munoz and his queer of color critique, normative desires for respectable, visible employment and stable, interdependent fictive kinship in relation to long histories of criminalization against third genders, hijras, and other gender nonconforming folks in India. For example, Jessica Hinchy's amazing work on, she's a hijra historian, and she does amazing work. She looks at the governance of hijras in 19th century Northwestern province, which is, of course, today UP. And she notes how the colonial administration was anxious to police third gender formations as they were viewed as a threat to British imperial interests. Explicitly declared ambitions to extirpate hijras were operationalized by making their labor and presence in public illegal, by policing their movement, and by confiscating their property and banning intra-household inheritance. Although there remain few resources that speak historically to South India's princely states, which Hinchy does admit had less stringent regulations than those under direct colonial rule, she nevertheless highlights present-day continuities with efforts to police the mobility and presence of third gender formations in India today. And she explicitly mentions how Bangalore in particular is really amping up data collection on hijra movement today, and they've been passing laws recently about that, right? And so in the context in which sex working are increasingly criminalized in India's aspirational world cities, an unregulated use of land leads to unaffordable housing. That mainstream, respectable, and visible employment offers a hope out of quotidian experiences of violence should come as perhaps no surprise. Although queer of color critique provides a nuanced, relational, or perhaps disaggregated understanding of queer precarity by underscoring the experiences of those minoritized in hegemonic subcultural theorizing, we are still left with the question of whether the Kochi Metro program, which is attempting to uplift trans women as a group, can actually lead to their political organization, which is an implicit aim of the Metro project and Kudumbashree at large. And so here I'm going to make a point that I'm welcoming feedback because I'm not settled on this, but I'm thinking of how folks Kudumbashree political imperatives have compared the program to SIWA and other self-help groups that have drawn attention to how the focus on household upliftment serves to undermine the potential decentralized, responsible development initiatives have mobilizing gender as an oppositional and organized social formation. When women are presumed to play a functional role as altruistic heads of household, the women have little room to mobilize based on solidarity, and the structure of such development practices preempt the cultivation of solidarity based on shared experiences. To put it in and so here again, I'm thinking of Devika's work on how the Kudumbashree in many ways can fail to organize women into a pseudo union, the way that the CPIM has been very effective through, you know, in much more successfully in general. And so we similarly might be skeptical on whether the Metro experiment will in fact answer the original demands made on the government by trans activists seeking retribution for systemic violence. Our findings suggest that political mobilization of trans women takes place prior to, rather than as a result of Kudumbashree. This is important because such mobilization and community are perhaps are effects that seem to keep the remaining employees around, who are thus made the raw material claims the LDF may make in positioning the program as a success. Okay, and so I will just move on to what I'm going to move on to this last concluding section about how I plan or how we're thinking about queering the infrastructure and what it means to Kochi as an emerging city or as a vastly changing city. So the Kochi Metro experiment when taking into consideration the experiences of trans labor, challenges received understandings of the relationship between worlding, infrastructure, and sexual citizenship in neoliberalizing southern cities. For anthropologist Iowa, worlding refers not to a single unified political process, but to diverse spatializing practices that mix and match different components that go into building an emergent system. And she draws on Deleuze to make a rhizomatic kind of analysis of the worlding process at large. Our research indicates that the symbolic import and materiality of the Kochi mega project involve not only complex assemblages of actors with varying visions of what makes the global city, but that the case complicates theories that depict the southern city as always aping the success of the world's metropoles. While extant literature on worlding practices in the global south tend to focus on large cities anxious to maintain national status through referential worlding projects, and here we of course know that the Delhi metro is a favorite example among Indian urbanists, right? That the Kochi metro, by contrast, offers a different vision of the stakes in worlding that we find in those capital cities and financial centers that already command national prestige and political economic authority. For queer and trans folks, Kerala is generally narrated as a state of outmigration, one uninhabitable as a space of exceptional conservatism and little queer public culture. For municipal authorities, the Kochi metro may be a showpiece intended for a global audience, but for the trans women workers, its promise lies in the potential to address the sub-region of South India and the nation of India. Kochi is not vying to be the next Paris or London or Singapore or New York, like we see in Delhi and Bangalore. But through this program, women are seeing an opportunity to present Kochi as similarly livable as other Indian cities for cosmopolitan and progressive youth and queer folk. The trans promise of the metro is not that standards Hello?
Lars, we can hear you. You can please.
Okay, I can continue.
Sorry,
okay,
sorry for that.
No, I'm almost done. I'm almost done here. The trans promise of the metro is not that standards will be similar to old European cities, but that Kerala's financial center will be a modern, livable city for trans women and a center of queer cultural production in its own right. In this way, our clear-eyed informants invested promise in the Kochi metro in order to destabilize the metronormative impulse shared by Malayali trans women. So for Jack Halberstam, queer literary theorist, the city is often represented and imagined as the proper place and time of queer cultural production, modernity, citizenship, and the promise of the good life. As a normative idea, cities with this promise results in geopolitical homogenization of sexual space in which non-urban queer life is subordinated and evacuated of potential and recognizability. Queer imaginaries in India similarly view the T1 cities as the desired locations and areas of refuge for trans women across the country, including those from Kerala. Indeed, the trans women workers of Kochi Metro sought to make a political point that Kochi is a place where trans women can survive and assert claims in public culture and urban space. This sentiment echoes Scott Herring's queer anti-urbanism and a general trend we're seeing in queer theory to really question the status of the urban and these mega global cities. Scott Herring is, of course, talking about the US context and arguing against what he calls the ruralization and unincorporation of queer life outside large coastal cities. We can extrapolate his relational understanding of how metronormativity relegates purportedly non-metropolitan cities to queer cultural wastelands. Kerala is often narrated as a hopeless site for queer life, and the trans women employees sought to personally disrupt this narrative. And so in conclusion, it is In the context of a neoliberal infrastructural project that trans women activists are attempting to assert claims to urban citizenship and position Kochi, and by extension Kerala, as a place in which trans life can thrive and be made pleasurable. Such a political vision complicates both queer geographic theorizing, which tends to utilize the very urban-rural dichotomy they seek to displace, and more general progressive assumptions that the neoliberalization of cities, which require accumulation by dispossession and attendant methods of securitization, actually render trans lives unlivable wholesale. The Metro project does not only attempt to make the space livable, but opens opportunities for trans women to make claims or hail the state. Neoliberalism, in the case of the Kochi Metro, requires us to consider anew assumptions that the reorganization of space catering to global capital necessarily results in the eradication, extermination, or removal of subaltern lives. The tension remains. For some trans women, the Kundambashri project is another example of state malice and ineptitude. Yet for others, it is one avenue that makes trans emplacement actually possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Lars. Thank you, Mythri. Mythri, do you want to add something more? So can we go for discussion?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. 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 So thank you, both of you, for giving us a wonderful exposition of what is actually happening with the transgender community or Q community by taking a Metro project as a case study. From Mythri's presentation, we could find a lot of things about the migrants, why transgender people are migrating to some other urban spaces rather than remaining in the southern cities or southern localities. And she had been using another serious or raising another serious issue of traditional femininity, because when it comes to the salaries, when they asked for more salaries, the response of that MD was actually that made us to think about the way society, how the society they look at this community. Don't expect more than that of what we give to women. So that kind of gender discrimination is there when it comes to female labor, and that is being extended to the trans women who are working with this particular project. And also by using the experience of medieval Europe, women have been dispossessed, and even Lars tried to bring that point in the context of Kundambashri, because when it comes to Kundambashri, we always think that a lot of entitlements have been given to Kundambashri, but at the same time, it is given in terms of some livelihood activities and other things. But when it comes to the redistribution of land, redistribution of very serious assets, we are still not even thought about that kind of issues. So here, I think a lot of new thoughts or very critical thinkings have been put forward by both of the scholars. I hope more discussion would follow from our students and the participants in the conference. So the forum is open for discussion, and those who want to raise queries, you can ask directly to both of them. Thank you. I think there is a question in the chat box. Can you read it out, Mythri?
Do I need to read?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should
So,
I read it for you? Okay, fine. Siddiq, please go ahead.
yeah, the question is, can this job and opportunity help these queer groups to overcome the colored view of society, the mindset of people? Even paid workers like Zara Sheikh had struggles all along. So this is a question raised by Manu Pratap, one of our PG student, first year student. So if you have anything to respond, then please.
Well, Manu, thank you for that question. And what you're really asking is the 10,000 rupee question, which is central to the project. Can actually this type of employment, or even any employment, really offer a sense of empowerment, or an empowerment that is substantive and objectively observable? And so I'm not sure. I can let Mythri answer for her take on this. I am undecided in a more objective sense, but we embarked on this project to see if we could study it from the perspective of the workers themselves. So again, because there was this overarching narrative of failure coming from both the popular press and among queer activists. And so I was, in Bangalore at the time when all of this kind of was hitting the English language press, it seemed very obvious that the program would flop, and that everyone would kind of disband and return to wherever they came from. And so we really wanted to draw out both the perspectives that are quite critical from a political position, finding the Kumbhashri to be politically inadequate, as well as looking at folks who were trying to use that program to really promote their own vision. So I think underlying your question is, how exactly do we define empowerment, which is almost like the study of development itself. And if you find that you can create you can support your family and create a certain visibility, then some women have found success. Whether that translates into Indian society at large is a huge question. But as we're seeing, every political party, including the BJP, is speaking to at least trans, if not lesbian, bisexual, gay, and queer issues. So we are seeing, I think, rapid changes at both the central, state, and municipal levels.
Thank you, Lars and Mythri, for the wonderful presentation. I have a few similar questions, in fact. It's not a question, rather than my thought. So you had, in the beginning, Mythri said that your work is, in fact, from the perspective of the worker, queer worker, right? So it's an ethnographic narration in that sense. So now the question is that we came to know about the employability of, or employment of this queer labor as a policy matter, right? Now it is actually evolved because of the police commissioner's involvement in that one. So one side you have this genealogy of being them employed in that particular space. At the same time, it is again painted on the other side that it's a policy kind of decision. Okay, so now that may be culminated later on, but now how do we basically rectify this problem from the perspective of a worker themselves? When you had, in fact, had field work on, you were talking about, you have respondent in that sense. So the queer responder, what is actually their perspective to change this sort of an environment, even if we employ them? Because I have known to many other queer workers in different government, system. So how do we basically, sensitize this kind of a problem to be part of our labor class and things like that? I think, are we clear?
Yeah, I think, well, in a very basic sense, just some of the employee benefits that we might expect from formal white-collar jobs, which are in quite a minority of the job market for LGBTQ folks, such as recognition of different types of kin when taking leave, non-discrimination for taking time off for sexual realignment surgery, and these kind of benefits, which in certain contexts might be quite basic, are still lacking among government employees who are being incorporated into the state through an anti-poverty development program. I think Mythri had, I think some of the informants said some specific things to you about what they actually wanted to see out of the workplace.
Yeah, so, you know, I have not talked about all the things that some of these workers told me. So one of the things is, you know, there is a structural way in which queer people are discriminated, whether, you know, you go to the, for example, even the transgender justice boards that, you know, at the district level we have made, even they are not sensitized enough to be, you know, be empathetic. For example, some of these are psychologists who sit there, psychiatrists, who ask the most insensitive questions to a trans person when they come there for this identity card. So there is a structural way, you know, in which we are transphobic and homophobic, and that, so there is also a larger question of homophobia, I think, that we need to address both structurally but also institutionally. So I think there is a lot that we can do in terms of institutional, you know, just like, you know, when we implemented Dalit and OBC reservation, it was a process, right? So in the same manner, you know, we need a lot of state-led and institution-led, society-led action. But at the same time, there is also a question of consciousness. It's not as though these things are outside us. These are we ourselves and, you know, our own family members. So there is also an inside and outside to this question in terms of how to. So we need to develop language, we need to develop institutional systems, but also we need to look at ourselves and our own experiences as sexual beings and citizens, how far that citizenship goes in Kerala.
And if I can add, I'm now with Sadiq, your question. I'm reminded of an excellent article by anthropologist Paul Boyce, who co-authored with Calcutta-based activist Pavan Dal, and they were looking at the implementation of the Nalsa judgment in rural Odisha and West Bengal. And what they found was that low-level courts actually had no idea that the Nalsa judgment was even passed. And so even when the Supreme Court or the center or even the state governments can take very progressive moves, we see, again, like so many other very progressive legal moves the state in India can make, that it then becomes another question of development, whether the central government can effectively link up with the state at various scales. So a lot of work, I think.
Thank you.
Mythri, one more question is there in the chat box. Can I read it for you?
Is it the one on female employment?
Yes, yes, yes. So if you want to respond, you can.
Does job polarization means, what does it mean? Is it about the the gender disparity.
Gender segregation of labor. Is it like that?
Yeah.
Might be. Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what would be the prospects of female employment? I think, you know, overall what we are seeing is a very dynamic situation, because there are women coming, more and more women coming into the labor market, into paid employment. Even though, you know, statistically it's not that clear, there is a lot of like debates about whether participation is increasing or is it like decreasing. But at the same time, in terms of how we see, like how we experience it, I think, you know, there are a lot of women coming into the labor market. And in that sense, it's a very interesting dynamic situation where the expansion of capitalist work culture and work, you know, that expansion is actually, I see it as a very positive thing. But of course, as we just talked about, there are all those little stories that are missing in that broad process. So it's also about being attentive to the macro questions that's being thrown up, but also about, you know, about communities and institutions, how they are dealing with it. So does that answer?
Yeah. We will discuss. Another question is there in the chat box from Parvati. I think Lars can answer to that. One more student, Sharon, she wants to ask a question directly to you. So Sharon, can you ask that?
Yes, ma'am. And
Yes,
first
yes,
of all, thank you to the scholars for giving a more ground reality perspective about the context. My question is a little bit general in context. It's in light of pink capitalism. Could you please give a brief explanation about targeted inclusion propagated by pink capitalism? And do you think globally there is a trend towards commodification of LGBTQ rights? That's it, ma'am.
Thank you, Sharon. That is an excellent question, and that's actually central to my doctoral research. So awesome. Thank you for asking.
Oh, welcome.
Yes. So pink capitalism, I mean, it's exploding, of course, all across the world. And we see that in India, it's, I mean, some researchers like in Kerala, Muralidharan, has talked about the homoeroticism of Malayali film ads and the transition and like the eroticism that very kind of buff shirtless men on Kerala's movie posters, and kind of providing a queer reading for that. I don't know whether that would be pink capitalism per se, but different theorists have sought to kind of bring a queer perspective into commodities already existing in India. However, we've seen with the confusing route that Section 377 has taken, decriminalized by Delhi, recriminalized by the center, and then again the center decriminalizes it, that pink marketing really came in waves. And so with that, my perspective is that when the center moved to recriminalize sodomy under 377, for many brands, and this is part of my research in Bangalore, they actually were able to capitalize on that because they could brand themselves as almost subverting the government or maneuvering around a national government through authority of an international structure of political legitimacy. So you would have foreign companies, mostly American IT companies, saying, well, if the Indian government is going to treat you this way, we're going to treat our employees better. And that actually will then feed into the very branding process of both employment and consuming of those goods. And you would see that with all the big kind of IT and computer companies that are have part of their operations offshored into Bangalore. And And along with that, you know, if we think of this, if we frame this as a part of just neoliberalism at large, in which the deregulation of sexuality then allows for private bodies to take a stronger position in governance, Nicholas Rose and other scholars of neoliberalism have said that always follows with a philanthropic effort towards inclusion. And so we see that at the very time when jobs are more precarious, that we see there's a greater drive for inclusion, because the specter of exclusion is so large and the stakes are so high if you're excluded in a more capitalist society. So what we're seeing is that many MNCs, multinational corporations, are hiring trans folks, but through philanthropic efforts. And this is similar but different to the Kundum-Bashri project. And that's something that I think Mythri and I were really interested with Kundum-Bashri, was that it's doing a sort of philanthropic inclusive gesture, but it's through the state, even if the infrastructure project itself might have been financed by, you know, global flows of capital. And so one of our interests is really, in a way, kind of comparing the Kochi Metro, which does stand out as a unique kind of state-centric approach to trans inclusion. And activists like Vahan are doing these, and Sheetal and other folks in Kerala are kind of trying to do this more through the government throughout Kerala, versus in Karnataka, most of that is in the private market. And so there's really an explosion there. And yeah, I hope that answers that question.
Thank you, Lars.
You can.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. One last question. Can you answer, Mythri? It is about that assault, and it's there in the chat box. Shall I read it to you? The worst thing to, have you seen that by Parvati? She is mentioning something about what you have told in the first part of your presentation. Okay, so with this, we can conclude because we are running out of time. Thank you.
Yeah, this is the problem, right? I mean, in Kerala and in many societies, many of the social, you know, responsibilities are given over to the police. So the police is, you know, is the one who's sometimes taking you to the hospital, or so many of the way in which when the state withdraws from many of these social responsibilities, it's natural that, you know, the police will take over, or the surveillance mechanism will take over. So in that sense, we have to see that this is faced by many people. Like even women can't go to a police station and report something. So in that sense, it's in the larger context of expansion of carceral and punitive state in which this harassment takes place. But I feel that transgender people they have been at the forefront of resisting this. In fact, more than others, they are the ones who are resisting these police excesses, even as much as they are also, you know, victims of it. So in that sense, they are very, I mean, whenever I speak to them, they are acutely aware of, you know, the excess of the state and the policing system, excesses of the policing and the state system. They are acutely aware of the carcerality of the state and the punitiveness of the state. So I mean, this is true of all, you know, vulnerable, dispossessed communities. They are the ones who are at the forefront of resisting these things everywhere and making it better for others. So in that sense, I don't know how to, you know, it's almost like you can't even answer that question without acknowledging their role in, you know, challenging this and resisting this carceral system.
Thank you, Mythri and Lars. We are actually running out of time. So thank you for enlightening us with a very pertinent and very serious issue which we are facing in whole of India, especially in Kerala. That is, even if we are claiming ourselves as very progressive and inclusive in nature, there are pockets of exclusion. There are pockets of discrimination. There are pockets of cultural ostracism in our state. So you brought you started the discussion on a whole lot of issues regarding the citizenship, the labor market discrimination, and the geopolitical positioning of different types of people who are there in the state, and the vulnerability of the sex minorities in the country. So I hope everybody here has made very good understanding of that situation. Thank you to both of you for being with us for 1.5 hours and talking to our students. Thank you so much.